This talk was given by Roshi Rafe Martin, guiding teacher of the Endless Path Zendo, a lay Buddhist community in Rochester, New York. Join our practice, in person or online, at endlesspathzendo.org.
Today is Saturday, May 10th. This week really was part of the memorial of Roshi Kapleau, I'd like to give you a little more history about Roshi Kapleau and my practice with him and the Zendo. This Zendo, as you know, is a hybrid. I trained for many years with Roshi Kapleau, and then I trained after that for as many years, actually, when you put them all together, with Diamond Sangha, starting with Eiken Roshi, the founder of Diamond Sangha. And so our practice here is a hybrid. Emotionally, it owes its greatest depth and debt to Roshi Kapleau, who really was such an important person, a life-saving person in both my life and Rosa's life. But Eiken Roshi's very subtle koan understanding became seminal and really important to refining that practice. And we tend to approach koans from a Diamond Sangha perspective, but our Zendo forms really align very closely with what Kapleau Roshi presented. I think there is no teacher who did a better job of translating Japanese texts into English chantable versions. Nobody did a better job than him with that. Not Eiken Roshi, not anybody. So what we'll look at is an unpublished chapter from a new book that Rick McDaniel, who's done a whole series on the transmission of Zen from China to Japan and then to the West. And I actually wrote the foreword for his book, Further Conversations with Zen Teachers. He's quite interesting, and he really researches and goes into things very carefully. The chapter's from an unpublished book, which will be coming out of his, which goes into each of the important transmitting Western teachers, first-generation teachers. And there's a chapter on Eiken Roshi, a chapter on Walter Nowick, all kinds of people. I think there's 8 or 9 or 10 altogether. But for the chapter on Kapleau Roshi, he interviewed me in part, and you'll see other people. And the chapter is a bit long for a teisho, so I've edited. I'm starting not at the beginning, and I won't go all the way to the end of the chapter to be, but it'll give you some sense of how things came about here. And it'll kind of close out our Memorial Week. Kapleau Roshi died on the 6th of May, 2004. And so today is the 10th. And it'll close out our week. Last Saturday, we played a teisho of his from 1975, which was really sweet and interesting. So, to begin with Rick McDaniel, or McDaniel. I never get that right. Apologies to Rick. The importance of the 3 pillars in the transference of Zen to the West can't be overstated. In spite of a handful of practice locations in North America prior to the book's publication, Zen in the mid-60s remained largely a concept or attitude or perhaps an aesthetic. After the book's release, it was clear that Zen was an activity, a practice which had the potential to bring about a change in the way people experienced the world, understood it, and related to it. Western interest in Zen may well have developed in the 1960s without the 3 pillars, but it is unlikely it would have been as extensive as it proved to be. Many of the young people who traveled to San Francisco or Los Angeles had a copy, occasionally stolen, in their backpacks. To this day, many more people read books about Zen than visit a Zen center even once. And likely hundreds of thousands of people, and he mentions a person that he interviewed earlier in the chapter, were able to start a private practice following the instructions in the book. Kapleau had the idea of writing a book about actual Zen practice to balance the idealized portraits of Zen, more commonly available in the West, while he was studying in Japan with Hokun Yasutani. He worked in it with the assistance of two fellow students of Yasutani, Koan Yamada and Akira Kubota. Kapleau is given title page credit for editing and writing the book, but within the Sanbo Zen lineage, and this is really contested from many different directions, it's complex. From the Sanbo Zen lineage, it is widely believed, and of course Yamada was the founder of, or continuer of Sanbo, and Kubota was connected with him. They succeeded Yasutani as second and third abbots of the Sanbo Zen school. It's believed there that they should have received equal credit. This is just the first of several controversies to arise about the book and its putative author. Let me add here, my own sense is that Yamada Roshi and Kubota were certainly important translators of material, and they're credited fully for that in the Three Pillars of Zen. However, it was Roshi Kapleau, Philip Kapleau at the time, who put together everything, created all the tissue, the sinews that connected all the material. In other words, he created the book, and he graciously, and I think generously, from my perspective as an author, credits the people who were so formative to him in providing material and helping him with skills he didn't have in terms of translation. But my sense is the book was his creation. And of course, it's so odd in the Zen world to see grudges getting carried on. But let's remember, even the greatest of Zen teachers is a human being. And we all have our issues and karma. And such is life. So in any case, to go on. Rafe Martin was both a student and friend of Kapleau and is the guiding teacher at the Endless Path Zendo, located 3 blocks from Kapleau's Rochester Zen Center. My wife, and this is quoting, my wife Rose and I came to Rochester relatively early, that is back in 1970. And we came already married with an 8-week-old child. So we were in a totally different realm than most of the people who were our age and who planned on being monks or nuns, because that's the only thing they knew about Zen. We had to find and invent our own path. Plus, I had already, before coming to Rochester for the Zen Center, found a way to mess myself up pretty badly practicing on my own without a teacher. So while it was a rather longish road getting back to myself, with Roshi Kapleau's encouragement, things eventually sorted out, and eventually he and Rose and I became very close. His daughter says we were his family. So along with Signana Graf Roshi and maybe 6 or so others, we were his closest people. Kapleau's birth family had not been particularly close. He grew up in the New Haven area of Connecticut, Rafe says. It was a very incommunicative family. It was a hard childhood. The only thing he really loved was he'd ride around with the junk man to make some money picking up rags and papers, and he would use that money to raise fox terrier puppies in the guy's barn. He loved that. I think his mother was Jewish, his father was Greek or Russian Orthodox, and it was complex. There was not much communication emotionally in the family. Obviously, there'd been something that had drawn two people from very different backgrounds together, or maybe very similar backgrounds, but in life, it was not a warmly communicative family, and I know he was a lonely child. In an era when regular church attendance was still common, this is going back to Rick's commentary, the last was a quote from me, Kapleau founded a club for atheists in his high school. In fact, he was president of the Atheist Club, although in later life he would wonder if that hadn't been evidence of suppressed religious sensibility, seeking an appropriate expression. He studied law at night school, supporting himself by learning shorthand and working as a court reporter. Health issues prevented him from completing the law degree, but he did establish a firm of court reporters. Those same health issues resulted in a medical deferment when the United States joined the war effort following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and he spent the war years as a court reporter in Connecticut. In 1945, he was recruited to serve as the chief court reporter for the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. And this is a quote from me. He became the chief Allied court reporter for the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. He was the guy sitting in the courtroom taking down in shorthand all the testimony. He was literally the guy making history. You can see him in some of the photos. If you look at the videos, you'll see him as one of the guys wearing headphones doing stuff. Kapleau described his experience of the tribunal in his book, Zen, Merging of East and West. And this is what Roshi Kapleau wrote about it. The testimony at the trials was a litany of Nazi betrayal and aggression, a chronicle of unbelievable cruelty and human degradation. Just to pause, these are words to take to heart these days. It's not just ancient history. To have an administration built around cruelty is a terrible thing. And it's all too much in our face these days, our own administration, to be honest. Listening day and night to victims of the Nazis describing the atrocities they themselves had been subjected to or had witnessed, one was shocked into numbness, the mind unable to comprehend the enormity of the crimes. The grim evidence of man's inhumanity to man, plus the apparent absence of contrition on the part of the massive Germans, plunged me into the deepest gloom. So, to go on, when the Nuremberg trials came to a close, Kapleau agreed to go to Tokyo to cover the trials there as well. It could hardly, he thought, have been worse than it had been in Germany. In fact, he found the atmosphere of the Japanese trials very different. Unlike the unrepentant Nazis, the Japanese seemed to accept that their current sufferings were the consequences of their behavior during the war. Two things happened when he got to Japan, Rafe explains. One was the Japanese took responsibility, which the Germans didn't. And he asked why, and they said, it's karma. He went, what's karma? And when he heard about cause and effect, something really stirred in him. The other thing was, he said, during his breaks in the Tokyo trials, he would tour around Tokyo and something would hit him when he walked on the grounds of some of the old Zen temples among the huge cryptomeria trees. He felt a sense of peace that he had never felt in his life. After returning to the United States, he read books on Buddhism and Zen. He also attended meetings of the Vedanta Society, investigated the Baha'i faith, and audited the lecture series at Columbia University given by D.T. Suzuki, whom he had visited in Japan. But none of this alleviated the personal difficulties experienced from the trauma of the court hearings. Eventually, a Japanese friend pointed out that Zen was not something that could be learned from books. So in August of 1953, at the age of 41, he sold his possessions and returned to Japan. He realized he had to do it, Rafe says. He sold his court reporting business and threw himself into the House of Buddha. It was very tough for a Connecticut/New York ordinary kind of guy suddenly to be eating miso and tofu and living with no central heating. For the next 13 years, he studied with a succession of 3 teachers, Soa Nakagawa, Dayun Harada, and Hakun Yasutani. Each of them had a unique personality, and he had a correspondingly different relationship with each. Roshi Kapleau and Nakagawa called themselves the 2 hobos, Rafe says. They were very close. Nakagawa would take him around to different places, and they used to listen to Beethoven together. He said if it wasn't for Nakagawa and his receptivity to him, he doubted he could have lasted in Japan. It was so hard and so different. But then Nakagawa felt that Harada Roshi would be a better teacher for him. Whereas Nakagawa had been nurturing, Harada was strict. His style of Zen would come to be called samurai, characterized by blows with the kyosaku and shouts. Yasutani was Harada's student in air, but he worked with lay people rather than monastics and accordingly moderated the harsher elements of the teaching. All three emphasized the importance of attaining Kensho, and on August 5, 1958, after an intense period of effort during sesshin with Yasutani, Kapleau achieved it, describing the experience as feeling like being a fish, swimming in an ocean of cool, clear water after being stuck in a tank of glue. Kapleau remained with Yasutani for another 8 years, deepening his insight, but also taking time to travel about Asia and familiarize himself with other spiritual traditions. While on a visit to the Sri Aurobindo ashram in Pondicherry, India, he met a young Canadian woman, Delancey Robinson, who returned with him to Japan, where they were married. He also began, along with Yamada and Kubota, to gather material for what would become the 3 pillars of Zen. One of his major contributions was the result of his shorthand skills. A handful of North Americans and Europeans had come to Japan to take up Zen practice, and some made their way to Yasutani's Zendo. Kapleau, who is now acting as Yasutani's translator, joined the students during the private student-teacher interviews called Doksan, and was able to transcribe these meetings. By 1965, Kapleau had found a publisher for the 3 pillars. He had been ordained a priest by Yasutani and was preparing to return to the United States. He had not completed his formal training, and it would be a matter of controversy what authorization Yasutani had given him or what further authorization Yasutani intended to give him. In a letter to Koan Yamada, dated February 17, 1986, Kapleau admitted he had not received formal transmission. However, he adds, "Before I left Japan, Yasutani Roshi gave me a certificate saying I could act as a missionary teacher for his sect of Zen. You know, of course, that he broke away from the traditional Soto sect in Japan and formed his own religious organization." That was Sambo Kyoden originally. Not only did he give me this certificate, but he also gave me one of his robes and bowls. I interpreted this as evidence of our deep relationship at that time as an ordained disciple of his. With an increasing number of Western students coming to Japan, small as that number was statistically, both Yasutani and Kapleau felt that it was appropriate for the latter to return to the United States and introduce authentic Zen practice there. Before he left, however, he had a visitor. Bowden Colheed, Kapleau's successor at the Rochester Zen Center, tells the story. So Bowden says, Ralph Chapin in 1965, while Roshi Kapleau or Philip Kapleau was still in Japan, Ralph Chapin was in Kamakura, and he heard about an American who was practicing Zen, and he was curious, and he arranged a visit. He called up the Kapleaus, and he arranged to visit them in their apartment, and he saw the galley proofs of the 3 pillars of Zen spread out on the floor, and he became intrigued. He read a few paragraphs, and he said, "Looks interesting. How about when it's published, sending me 20 copies?" So the 20 copies arrived. This would have been 1966, and at that time, Ralph was part of a group, an eclectic spiritual group of about 20 people, mostly women, and that group included Chester and Doris Carlson, our great benefactors. Chester Carlson was the inventor of Xerox, electronic photocopying, and he handed out these 20 copies, Ralph did, of the 3 pillars of Zen, and on the basis of that little group, more Vedanta than anything, invited Philip Kapleau to come to Rochester. And that's how it all got started. And the Carlsons were very generous, and then things were off and running. In fact, the Carlsons were so impressed with the book that they distributed 5,000 copies to libraries throughout the country. Kapleau accepted their invitation to come to Rochester, which then became his home base. His first students were members of Doris's Vedanta group, consisting largely of women in their 40s who were exploring various religious traditions. Kapleau taught them how to sit zazen and set up a regular schedule of sittings. The group, however, did not show up on Sunday mornings because most of them remained regular church attendees. Then readers of the 3 pillars began showing up in Rochester as well. Almost immediately, there was tension. between the newcomers and the original Vedanta group. Rafe notes that while the newcomers were often young, they weren't precisely hippies. He describes them as refugees from contemporary culture. We weren't a hippie commune, we were refugees. Essentially, all of us who got to Rochester were refugees from the 60s, which had imploded by then. The type of Zen that was being taught in California at the time, he says, was a very different realm. We were East Coast, so we were really weird. Nobody around here had any feeling for the Pacific Coast or Japan, Asia, or anything. We were refugees from the 60s, and what we landed in was not the United States of America, but the United States of the Tang era, which we believed in. We were going to recreate the Tang era. We had found meaning and purpose. One of the three people with Kapleau, when John Pauline, and John is one of the people who's co-director of the Zen Center right now in Rochester, and one of the people that Rick opens his chapter with, first visited was Hugh Curran. Hugh's family had immigrated from Ireland to Canada when he was young. Hugh is a very interesting guy and is a Zen teacher now through Walter Noack. Anyway, having been raised Catholic, he explains, I'd considered entering the seminary after high school. I went on Catholic retreats, and when I came east, went to La Trappe d'Oka, a Trappist monastery in Montreal, to see if I wanted to join their community. I was religiously inclined very early on. I went to college at St. Francis Xavier in Nova Scotia and then became a student at Temple University to finish off a degree there. One of my professors was Bernard Phillips, and Bernard had just come back from Japan. Bernard was teaching a course and told me I should come to the Zen retreat he'd organized, and the retreat happened to be at a Quaker center, less than 10 miles from my house. The retreat was with Yasutani Roshi, who was, according to Bernard, a well-known Zen master. I had no idea what I was doing, and I didn't even know how to sit cross-legged. I went through a 7-day retreat without any background. When he became subject to the draft during the Vietnam War, Hugh returned to Canada. I went to Toronto, where our family had lived for 2 years after we immigrated from Ireland, and I got a job as a counselor in the Clifton Home for Boys. I joined a little Zen group that was just forming, which included some South Africans, some of whom had gone on retreat at the Rochester Center and mentioned Philip Kapleau, who was looking for an assistant. So in the spring of '67, I went to Rochester with a small backpack and sat with his group. He didn't have anybody there except the old Vedanta group, and I had been with Yasutani Roshi, and he had been a student of Yasutani Roshi. So he said, "Why don't you join me here?" So I said, "Fine." And he said, "If you're willing to stay, there's a room up to the top floor, and I need a monastic. I have somebody here to take care of things." Oh, I have nobody here to take care of things. I had managed to clear up my draft status, by that time receiving a 4C classification, as someone who had returned to their own country. I became very involved at the Rochester Zen Center, soon becoming the first monastic, the first cook, the first attendant, etc. I also looked after the Zendo. I was given a lot of responsibilities based on whatever I was able to handle. I remember meeting Hugh at one point at the Rochester Public Downtown Library. He was with his girlfriend then, Susan, who became his wife. And he said, "What are you looking at for here?" And I said, "Oh, I'm looking for a book on whales." And he said, "Why would you be interested in whales? What about Ireland?" And then his girlfriend, Susan, poked him. He said, "Whales, that animal that swims in the sea." Anyway, that was Hugh. Hugh was Kapleau's attendant when the break with the Carlsons took place. Doris had a strong personality, this is a quote from you, and could be very abrupt when she made a decision. She and Chester had been impressed by the 3 pillars of Zen and said they were willing to underwrite the costs of the center, as well as give Kapleau a regular stipend. It was a fairly substantial amount at the time, so he was able to send money back to his wife Delancey and their daughter in Kamakura. But the breakup made me feel somewhat guilty because I fed his irritation at Doris by saying, "How come we're letting Doris tell us what to do so much of the time?" Doris would leave little notes with big red ink writing on them after most of the weekly sittings that she attended. She would write, "These young people who are sitting with us are smelling up the zendo. Tell them they need to take a bath." This was the beginning of a surge of young people coming to the center. Some of the older people, including Doris, resented them. And gradually Kapleau became more and more resentful of her. He told me, again, this is you, he told me he thought he could work with her Vedanta tradition, but it got more nerve-wracking dealing with her. He became edgier. And unfortunately, I fed the fire by saying, Yasutani or Taisan would have been Edo Shimano at the time, wouldn't put up with this. I think that's correct. Taisan would have been, yeah. At one point, he answered the phone when she called to give him more suggestions about what he should do or shouldn't do, and he burst out in an angry rant. Next thing, which was not terribly unusual, next thing you know, she wrote a letter and said, "We are no longer giving financial support to the Zen Center." Kapleau's response had not been all that unusual, since he tended to bottle up his anger and go into periodic tirades. "I desperately wanted people my own age to come to the center." Again, this is you. "Since the older crowd were not people I felt wholly comfortable with." That's a very humble admission from you. It was a very, very solid person. And there were more than enough of these young people arriving. They came from across the United States, Canada, Mexico, and even Europe. Zen was not the only Asian spiritual tradition being explored by young Westerners at the time. In 1966, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, Hare Krishnas, was established in New York, and by the next decade, saffron-robed young people were chanting in the streets and in airports. After the Beatles' famous trip to India in '68 to study with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, centers teaching transcendental meditation flourished throughout the West. For those who found Buddhism too austere, there were alternatives. Delancey, for example, although one of the Enlightenment stories in the Three Pillars is hers, and if you haven't read it, it's quite a beautiful story, quite moving. Delancey was, well, we'll get into that, remarkable person. Ultimately, she decided that Zen was not her path, and she moved to Ottawa with their daughter, where her sister led a meditation center associated with Sri Chinmoy, a Hindu teacher of Bhakti yoga. Delancey eventually adopted the name Maitreyi and established a Sri Chinmoy Center in Toronto. And they also ran, which isn't in Rick's thing, they also ran a terrific vegetarian Indian restaurant, which we used to go to whenever we were in Toronto. And often Roshi Kapleau's daughter, Sudarshana, who will be leading the pilgrimage to Japan next year or so, or the year after. 27, right? We are one of the waitresses at that restaurant. It was called Annapurna. And I'm sorry it's no longer there. It was terrific Indian vegetarian food. Anyway, Rafe remembers Delancey with fondness. Quote, "She was a remarkable woman and a profound one. She became a disciple of Sri Chinmoy, which changed things. Originally, the Zen Center was going to be Roshi and Delancey and their daughter. So originally, Roshi Kapleau was not going to be here alone. Originally, it was going to be a family, not a solo guy at the center. So who knows how different the whole Zen Center would have been if Delancey had stayed a Buddhist. So they had an unusual but a very spiritual relationship. There was never any disquiet between them, but Delancey, she was a profound woman. If you believe in past lives, I'll leave that to you. She could look back. She could look at you and see things. She was a lovely woman. Rose and I loved her. We sometimes visited her with Roshi. I have a gift from her right here. It's wherever I was downstairs. I was being interviewed in the living room with Rick on the phone or Zoom. It's silver paper wrapped over cardboard, and fixed onto the paper are patterns formed of fallen autumn leaves, which she made and gave me many, many years ago. After the Vedanta participants left and Delancey returned to Canada, conditions at the center began to change. Many of the people who had come to Rochester would have looked askance at the other spiritual options available, considering them naive or frivolous, what was taking place at the Zen Center was definitely not frivolous. Like Aiken, Suzuki, and Miyazumi, Kapleau modeled the center he was establishing on the Japanese examples with which he was familiar. In his case, he had 3 teachers with whom he worked. Sunyata Graf, previously Gail Silverman, is a Kapleau heir, who sees some irony in the direction he took. Roshi Kapleau had spent 13 years in Japan, and the interesting thing about him is that when he was at Harada Roshi's monastery, it was very strict, very samurai. The stick was used, and shouts and blows, and that whole style of Zen. Roshi Kapleau was hit all night long with a stick, right? And he kind of relished that story and how his shoulders were bleeding. And I always thought, why? Why would somebody think that was a good thing? And the thing is, he didn't penetrate his koan when he was there. Finally, he went to Yasutani Roshi's Zendo, which was run by a little old lady. It was very small, very lay-oriented, completely different atmosphere. And it was there that he had his breakthrough. When he came to the U.S., what style did he bring? Harada Roshi style. The stick was used fiercely. It was used, I think, inappropriately. And I have to tell you, Sunyata Roshi was very close with Kapleau. She loved him, honors him, totally to this day. And yet, when interviewed by Rick, she really was completely honest about her take on what the atmosphere was. And it is a puzzle. He so admired Harada Roshi, but that style had not worked for him. And yet the style he transmitted was a style that couldn't even work for him. It was a real puzzle, and I think it created a number of problems. And here we are completely a lay Zendo in much more that original tradition of Yasutani Roshi, ironically, of lay people practicing together, people with families and jobs and meaningful work. So as I said, Rose and I had to invent our own style of practice at the Rochester Zen Center, because we were among the very few who came married and with a family, with a child. And so we had to be lay people from the beginning. And anyway, to go on, during retreats, when the Doksan bell rang, retreats means sesshin, meditators exploded off their cushions in order to get into line, because there was never enough time for all of them to meet with the teacher. That's one reason I asked people to email me before Doksan, the day before, so that I know how many people are coming, which means I know when to get up in the Zendo and leave for the Doksan room, so that everybody gets in. There's no Doksan rush here. Everybody who wants to come to Doksan gets into Doksan. That's the reason I asked if you would let me know ahead of time, because I saw things that happened in Rochester, and we'll get into that. Probably 40 people got to go to Doksan, right? It was fierce, really. Fierce. Broken toes, cuts, bruises. Some people would be bleeding. Bowden Cole, this is still Sunyata Roshi. Bowden Coleheat and I once collided coming out the door. I can't remember who ended up on top. I think he ended up on top of me, helped pick me up, and I just ran. It was insane. But it was encouraged in a way. There was an enormous amount of energy that went into those sessions, and that with that many young people with all sort of repressed sexual energy and everything else that was being poured into practice, it wasn't, and then she goes, it wasn't entirely healthy. I'll say. Bowden admits that even after he took over the center, the scramble for places in the Doksan line could be brutal. I remember being astonished when I was with Aiken Roshi in Hawaii. They would announce Doksan, and I was used to this in sesshin there. And I was, we're in regular sittings whenever. So I was used to the Doksan rush in Rochester. They'd ring the, announce, bing, 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 you hear the Doksan bell. People would storm and leap over one another, leap over the tan, smash into one another. It was insane. So I'm at Aiken Roshi's place in Palolo, their temple there in Honolulu. They go, Doksan will begin in a minute. You hear boom, 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 and they go boom, right? And then a couple of people get up and straighten out their mats and walk quietly from the zendo. Then the next time the bell rings, the student bell rings, and you hear ding, 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 the bell from the student, ding, 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 ding. Then a couple of more people would kind of get up and straighten out their mats and walk from the zendo. And after, quite a long time of people dribbling in and dribbling out, then there would be, in this kind of very solemn, gloomy kind of voice, kind of a last call for Doksan. And a few more people, the last people remaining in the zendo, would kind of get up and slowly straighten their mats and slowly walk. And it was like, after Rochester, it was like going to another planet. It was like unbelievable. And you realize, wait a minute, Eiken Roshi is really this great, subtle, profound teacher. I guess it can work like this too. It doesn't have to be like that. It isn't what Zen has to be at all. So for me, it was really like eye-opening. Anyway, recently, Bowden admits that, and he goes, it's a puzzling phenomenon. Recently, someone broke his hand running a little recklessly to Doksan. Even though he must have known he would get in, he was one of the first ones to leave the zendo. But there's something about this kind of explosive, the Doksan bell rings and people just burst out of there. People ask me, why do people run to Doksan? Newcomers usually say it kind of with bemusement. Why do people run for this? And the best answer I've come up with is, I think it's because it's fun. You're sitting for hours in sesshin. You're sitting and sitting and sitting, and maybe there are people who just love the competition the way Sunyana and I used to, but I think it's just fun to run, to get up and run. It's like, well, I can see it. There's a drama to it. You've been sitting for days, and nothing's happening in your practice, really. And then the bell rings, and there's a moment of drama where you can show your stuff, you can prove to the world how enthusiastic you are or how desperate you are. And, I'm glad that's kind of over. In any case, and in Denver, sometimes before sesshin, Danon would meet with us all, and Danon Roshi, and say, well, do you want to have a Doksan Rush for this sesshin or not? We would vote whether to have Doksan Rush or just not, just people get up quietly. So former students describe a very masculine and slant to the style of Zen being presented. They use terms like boot camp to describe it, and in retrospect, they acknowledge that there was a time an element of play acting associated with it. Here's a little story that'll kind of give you the flavor of it, John Pauline says. At some point, a theater was showing samurai films, Kurosawa, and everybody went. I don't know what it was, Seven Samurai or some other Kurosawa movie. I think it was Hidden Fortress, which had just become available, and it was at the Eastman. I remember we all went to that. Everybody went, including Roshi. And the next day at Zazen, every young guy who walked in was doing a samurai walk. It's just like he rolls his shoulders and swaggers. And then Roshi Kapleau came in, and he was just Roshi Kapleau kind of moseying along. As a teacher, Kapleau could be intimidating. Mitra Bishop, another of his eventual heirs, was older than many of the members of the center, and during one retreat had difficulty making her way through the rush to the Doksan line, besides which she didn't feel she had anything to report. So when the bell rang, she remained on her cushion. After a couple of days of that, a monitor pulled her out of the Kinhin line and ordered her to go to Doksan. I went in and Kapleau Roshi said, why haven't you been to Doksan? And I said, I didn't have anything to say. And then he pulled himself up and roared at me, don't you think I might have had something to say to you? Although it was a time when American youth were involved in political activism, Sunyana notes that Kapleau was actually discouraged us from social outreach. That's definitely not the case now in Rochester, but at the time it was. Later on he shifted, though. Later on he shifted and became very concerned about the Vietnam War. He didn't promote out-and-out politicism, but he really wanted everyone to get out there and vote and to really stand up for values. And he made that pretty clear. In any case, and this was the 60s and 70s, there was so much activism going on, and he thought we needed to focus our attention. Yeah, so it was later. As I said, 60s and 70s, it was pretty focused that way. But later, he really branched out and felt it was important, even though Vietnam War was the 70s. In any case, memory being what it is, that's what I remember. He thought, and this is true, we needed to focus our attention within. He felt one of the problems with activism was that there was no core, no heart, no center, no compassion, that people were just throwing themselves violently into anti-activities rather than coming from a place of centeredness and compassion. So he felt we needed to focus our attention and develop ourselves. And Sunyana adds, we were so immature and so scattered and so undisciplined and so drug-hazed that I think he was probably right about that. It's just that there were repercussions. And one repercussion was that there was nothing more important in the world than enlightenment. And the more deeply enlightened you were, the better you were, you know? Somehow you were more Buddha-ish or something. And that had its effect, necessarily, not a good one. We were conceited, as all get out. So there were people who found the atmosphere at Rochester discomforting. Steve Stuckey, who would go on to be the central abbot of the San Francisco Zen Center, was another whose introduction to Zen came through the three pillars. I was living in Chicago in the late 60s in a commune that a group had started and had begun my personal investigation of what is the way my own memory and mind interferes with what I see. So for me, it was an interesting question. What can I actually see clearly? And I began to notice my own thoughts. So I started just on my own, stopping and investigating it. And then someone, a friend, handed me the book, Three Pillars of Zen, and said, this may be what you're doing. He chuckled at the memory. So I started sitting, just based on the instructions in the Three Pillars of Zen. And then, oh, this is what I should do. And I went, actually, and I met Philip Kapleau, and I didn't particularly like him. I was raised a Mennonite and a pacifist. And I felt his style was militaristic. It had that Japanese samurai Harada Roshi atmosphere, and it was like that. So that was kind of off-putting to me, and it was also very much oriented towards getting something, which I wasn't sure I wanted to get that much. I wanted to stop and inquire. That was more of my intuitive feeling about it. Those for whom Kapleau's style worked don't deny it was strenuous, but they remained grateful for what they gained from it. We were always exhausted, Sinana recalls. I was so tired after my years of getting up really early, going to sesshin all the time, working all day on my feet all day, that if I had 10 minutes, I would fall asleep. I used to go back to my apartment, sleep, come home, come back to the center, work, go home for half an hour, sleep. And that's what it was. We didn't have the energy for anything else other than the intensive practice we were involved in. But what else could I do? It wasn't that I was critical of it at the time. That was all I knew. That was going on. And I was so grateful to my teacher, and still am grateful to him, that he was willing to put up with this immature, really selfish person that I was. So she sighs and laughs gently. I don't think I could have put up with me. I don't think I would have put up with me. But he did. He must have seen something. For whatever reason, he was willing, you know. I worked very closely with him. I became his disciple in 1969. I was always with him. I was his secretary and taking care of his needs. And as a teacher, there was nobody else, no place else. Kapleau was cautious about making changes, but he wasn't inflexible. If he saw something wasn't working, he made adjustments. At first, students who completed the early koans, so-called miscellaneous koans, were awarded rakusus as symbols of accomplishment, a practice which unintentionally created a competitive environment. The atmosphere was highly competitive, Sunyana says, but it was competitive in terms of where you were at in your practice, who got through their koan, who was working on this book. You weren't supposed to talk about these things, but people inevitably found out about them, and people were really focused on that, advancing in wisdom. Not so much in compassion, sadly, but wisdom, definitely. With the Raksu thing, there was a sense of insiders and outsiders, Rafe admits, that decimated the community emotionally, and Roshi Kapleau was wise enough to change that completely. He decided that if you've been practicing for 3 years, regardless of whether you passed koans or not, any koans, you could ask then to receive a Raksu. He also minimized traditional Japanese ritualism and arranged for English translations of the chants, particularly the Heart Sutra. Yasutani wasn't happy with the changes, and that became a factor in the falling out between him and Kapleau. In spite of the challenges, a stable community evolved, and by 1981, Kapleau, who was then approaching 70, began to give thought to retiring. He was confident the Rochester Zen Center was firmly established, and he was tired of the winters in Rochester. A group of students was sent to Santa Fe to establish a satellite center, which is now Mountain Cloud Zen Center, which is becoming actually the center of international Sanbo lineage. And the Yamada Roshi's son, who's kind of the international head now of Sanbo lineage, gave a talk when they reopened Mountain Cloud, where I did some sesshin with Dana and Henry Roshi some years ago, and with Kapleau Roshi. If my memory is right, gave a talk where he really praised Kapleau Roshi and Aiken Roshi both as being, when he was a young man, and his father was Yamada Roshi, he so looked up to Kapleau Roshi and Aiken Roshi as just terrific human beings. And he felt that Kapleau Roshi would be very happy to see what was happening in Mountain Cloud. So underneath the surface disturbances, or the deep disturbances, the Sanbo also has a very positive feeling. Roshi Kapleau is a human being, a person. Anyway, Kapleau, Rafe points out, had a terrible sensitivity to cold, and as a young man, I think he and one of his brothers used to go down to Mexico. So when he started taking breaks from teaching at Rochester, he would go particularly to warm climates. Mitra was one of those who went to New Mexico. 17 of us came out from the Rochester Zen Center. I'm afraid this teisho may run a little long, but I hope you'll stick around. It has, I think, an interesting conclusion. Anyway, we went from Rochester to build a country retreat, and that became Mountain Cloud, that Kapleau Roshi had always wanted to have, and he was going to go in semi-retirement and just teach senior students. So Mitra says, I was with Kapleau Roshi when he moved out to New Mexico as his secretary and attendant. He only spent a year. I think there were 2 factors that entered into that his leaving. I picked him up at the airport when he moved there. We had already bought a house for him and renovated it for him. And I took him directly to a picnic that the Sangha had planned as a welcome. And at the picnic, one of the Sangha members, one of the local Santa Fe people, stood up and said, Roshi, we love having you here. We want to have you here, but we don't want you to tell us what to do. They were definitely not East Coasters at that point. I know those people, and they're a lively and very interesting crew. In fact, with Dana, we used to do sesshin at Mountain Cloud in Santa Fe, and most of the people were from that area, and they're still old friends now. And he quietly took it in, Mitra says. And then he lived in Santa Fe for a year, almost next door to the center, to see how things would work. He came every Sunday to sitting, teisho, doksan, and invited the Sangha to his house for Sunday night movies. We have movie night tonight, people. I will mention that because Mitra mentions it was rare that anyone joined him for the movies. I think that was sad for him. I'm sad for me. And most of the Sangha was interested in only minimal involvement, although there were a few of us who were more committed to practice. At the end of the year, partly because he'd fallen and broken his arm, and partly because, get this, he hadn't realized it was so cold in New Mexico. He went, New Mexico, yeah, it's in the United States and it's got Mexico in it. I'm going to move there. But the house that he had, I remember staying with him out there, the wind would come howling around it. It was up on a bare hill, and it would be going, whoo, whoo. And in the winter, it was just cold, and it felt so lonely and isolated. He was a very social person, so you could kind of see the handwriting on the wall. Anyway, he just didn't seem dedicated. Enough people were really dedicated to doing it the way he wanted to do it, and he left. And there was another factor. At the same time, he had left his senior disciple, Tony Packer, in charge of the Rochester Zen Center. And once she was on her own, Tony found herself increasingly uncomfortable with some of the forms used at the center. In particular, one thing, the practice of having students prostrate themselves before her. We don't do prostrations, as you know, in Doksan. I have people do a standing bow coming in, a standing bow at the mat, a T-bow when leaving. We used to do 3 full prostrations coming into Doksan.
No.
Yeah, 3? No?
No.
Just 1?
Just one.
And then another prostration leaving? Yeah, we don't really remember. We're old. We remember that it was more dramatic than what we tend to do these days, in any case. And she insisted on a number of changes, which some senior members believed subverted the taught atmosphere, which they believed was necessary for Zen practice. Well, being with Eiken Roshi told me the only thing necessary for Zen practice is an aspiration to wake up, to be of benefit to all beings, and to keep at it. That whole atmosphere thing really wasn't necessary. It generates itself as one focuses. You don't have to force it. Anyway, people who were used to that militaristic samurai style found themselves becoming extremely vulnerable. This is me ad-libbing in here, when that structure was removed. And it made them, I think, scared that the Zen was disappearing from the Zen center. But of course, that wasn't the Zen of it. That was a side effect that could have been dispensed with. But they didn't know that because they had grown up within it. And it had worked for them. For that group of people, it worked for them. Then Tony met with Kapleau, who was in Mexico at the time, to inform him she could no longer continue to work within Buddhist tradition. Bowden had accompanied Kapleau to Mexico at that time, and Roshi discovered I had some linguistic abilities, he wrote, or said to Rick, and he'd been trying to write Zen Merging of East and West, and had been floundering. So he decided he needed an assistant, and he took me down to Mexico, I think 3 years in a row. We spent the whole year in Mexico in 1980, and he got a call from Tony Packer 2 weeks before he was due to come back up to Rochester for a trustees meeting, and said, I need to talk, is what she said. That is. And from our house in Mexico, he said, oh, good, I'll be there in 2 weeks. And she said, can't wait. I want to come down there. And he said, okay. So she came down. They went out in the backyard and talked for maybe an hour. And he came in to get a cup of tea or something. He said, Tony said she could no longer work in a Buddhist context. He was dumbfounded because she had never indicated she had any problem with the Buddhist context before. Anyway, that was it. And then he came up for the trustees meeting and talked more with her. And that's when the big split happened. I was still in Mexico, it just passed me by. I wasn't involved in the acrimony, all the discussions about whether she should go or stay and everything. But our mission statement says a Zen Buddhist center, a Zen Buddhist context. And so it was decided, or maybe she decided, she had to leave. About half the membership of the Zen Center followed her, first to another location in the city, and then to a retreat center about an hour south of Rochester. You know, this is me, Rafe notes, quoting myself, you know, Roshi Kapleau never had a negative word about Tony. I think what happened is she came in, took over the Zen Center, so she's going to replace him. And I think she discovered how many hurt people there were, people for whom the system did not work, who felt really uncared for, disregarded. And I think she took that on. And to counter that, she decided to start changing everything. And at some point, she decided she would have to get rid of Buddhism and focus on attention. Without all the other structures, it created a huge split in the Rochester community. There were very Buddhist people. There were psychologically oriented non-Buddhist people. There were hurt people. There were people who had been victorious and at the top of the Zen food chain. And Roshi Kapleau said she's the teacher. It's up to her what she wants to do. And when she said she was not going to be a Buddhist anymore, he said, well, then you have to not be at the Rochester Center. It was her way, I think, of getting out of a situation she didn't want to be in, which was she'd rather be taking care of people and teaching them to pay attention in their lives rather than upholding something she saw as creating pain and division. So it was her way out, and it was also her personality. She grew up in Nazi Germany. Her mother, I believe, was Jewish, and they got out, but she was horrified by nationalism and belief in systems, traumatized by it, and always wanted nothing to do with that kind of thing. And I think Rochester hit her in the face with it when she realized how it was working as a staff and a residential training program. When he returned, Kapleau supported some of the changes that Tony had implemented, and the samurai atmosphere of the 1960s and 70s began to mellow. He outgrew the structure that he created, is the way Rafe put it. We were walking on a beach in Florida once after he retired. This is my personal experience. And I told him about things I thought had gone wrong in the old days in Rochester. The structural organization, the issues of staff versus Sangha, issues about Doksan and koan practice, all of it. And he listened. He didn't say a word while I spoke. Then he looked at me and he said, "You know what was wrong with the Rochester Center? Me. I wasn't evolved enough when I first started it. I wasn't mature enough, and that got reflected in its structures." Basically, he just up and owned it completely. It was quite impressive. I was very moved by his response. I've never forgotten it. There I was criticizing the very thing he had dedicated his life to. And he just took it in and owned it. Not a ripple of defensiveness whatsoever. Complete openness and humility. He found a winter retirement place in Hollywood, Florida, where he stayed until he developed Parkinson's disease. Then he needed more support, Rafe says, and so he moved back to Rochester. He died in the backyard of the center, surrounded by friends, under the tree in the back. I was just flying back from a conference I was speaking at in Reno, and a friend picked me up at the airport in Rochester and said, "Roshi just died." He was laid out in the Zendo after that. Signana Roshi and my wife Rose were the two people who washed his body and prepared him for burial. When his body, dressed in formal Zen robes, was laid out, students placed a few parting gifts in the coffin, including some of his favorite chocolate bars and a harmonica. He was buried at the Zen, well, he loved to play the harmonica. We used to have sing-alongs. There's a great photo of him. Remember when Jukai Allen Ginsberg was visiting? So he's playing on the harmonica. What?
Vesek, not Jukai.
Oh, it's Vesek, rather, right. Vesek. Roshi Kapleau is playing on his harmonica, and we're all singing with him, and there's Allen Ginsberg singing along. It was a great moment. We might have been singing, I don't know, For Auld Lang Syne, or I'll Be Forever Blowing Bubbles, or some song from the 30s that he had grown up with. Yeah. He was buried at the Zen Center's country retreat at Chapin Mill. The grave is marked by the former mill's large grindstone. It's so interesting. The grindstone is sitting right on top of Roshi Kapleau. It's just like this very fitting monument. There's a deep kind of Zen humor to it, I think. In any case, the stories people tell about Philip Kapleau often betray him as ornery and cantankerous, perhaps because those are stories that are the most fun to tell. But he could also be charming, was very insightful, was skilled at guiding students to their own deep awakening, and was a loyal friend. There are the controversies, of course. The most significant has to do with his credentials as an authorized Zen teacher. This might not have mattered as much had Zen not become formally organized in the West, but because it had matters of who could officially claim to teach became important. It wasn't just the issue of who is authorized to teach, but who also has the authority to authorize others to teach. In a statement dated January 16, 1986, Koan Yamada, who succeeded Yasutani Roshi as the head of what was then still called Sambo Kyoten, it's now just Sambo, specifically denied that Kapleau was a Dharma successor of Yasutani, noting that Kapleau had not completed the Koan curriculum, which was obligatory in that line. There is evidence that Yasutani had intended to carry out a ceremony in the United States, which might have formerly given Kapleau some degree of authorization as a Zen teacher. But before the ceremony took place, the two had become estranged. In the book, Zen Merging of East and West, Kapleau attributes this rupture to Yasutani's objection to certain adaptations or adaptions he had made to make the practice more palatable in the West. The stories around these objections often sound petty, such as whether it was appropriate to use a certain style of drum, the wooden drum, the mokugyo, when chanting the Heart Sutra in English. In the letter, Kapleau wrote to Yamada, quoted above, however, he identifies a more serious issue at the basis of their disagreement. After his sojourn in Hawaii, Ido Shimano had become Yasutani's translator and accompanied him to the sesshin Yasutani conducted in the United States. Having heard rumors about Shimano's continued inappropriate behavior with female students, Kapleau asked Yasutani. Kapleau had a very high ethical standard, he really did, not to bring Shimano with him when he visited Rochester, a suggestion at which Yasutani took umbrage. In the letter, Kapleau suggests that was why the ceremony did not take place. He expressed regret at having offended Yasutani, but Yasutani died before they were able to reconcile, which left his status within the traditional Zen establishment in question. Because he had not completed koan training or received official authorization, he was not formally recognized by either the Soto or Sanbo Kyodan hierarchies. He was careful not to claim to be a transmitted Zen master, although, after he learned that Richard Baker in San Francisco was using the term, he did adopt the title Roshi, pointing out, however, that the word only meant venerable teacher. It had not yet acquired the connotation of rank it would later have in American Zen. Kapleau did not have the papers, and for some, especially in the Sanbo Zen tradition, that was all there was to it. James Ford, who has formal transmission, both in the Harada Yasutani lineage and the Soto school, offers another take on the matter. James has been critical of Kapleau in print, but he also argues that the bottom line is the product, referring to the quality of the men and women whom Kapleau authorized to teach. I meet Bowden Colheed, and I meet a peer. I have no hesitation. That is a Zen teacher. So what I see is there is the vertical transmission, that's our tradition. You know, it's partly history and partly myth. It doesn't go back any further than the 7th century, and there have been a kind of awkwardness along the way. But there's also the lateral transmission, Zen teachers recognized by other Zen teachers. As for Bowden, after he took charge of the Rochester Center, he was offered formal transmission in the Soto system, but declined. As he explained, since I never worked extensively with any Soto teacher, such certification would, I believe, be a mere formality and contrary to the spirit of Zen's mind-to-mind transmission. Roshi Kapleau's seal, and now my 20 years of teaching experience, is more than enough for me. Kapleau himself could take intransigent positions on aspects of Zen orthodoxy, finally saying, for example, that people associated with the San Francisco school were wasting their time. Hogan Bays of the Great Vow Zen Monastery in Oregon has transmission in the White Plum lineage, but began his Zen career in Rochester. He says, if you went to Rochester in those days, you had a sense of purpose. You felt we were doing something really extraordinary. And in those days, Roshi Kapleau was always adamant that nobody else was doing it right, We were the apex of modern Zen, which in retrospect is kind of silly. But as a young person, I took that, and I didn't really seek out other practitioners for quite a while. There are two things I remember vividly that affected me very deeply from my time in Rochester. One is ethical living. I came away with the sense that Roshi Kapleau had a very, very high ethical standard, certainly from my perspective then. And secondly, is the aspiration for awakening, that it's possible that that which has not been realized can be realized. I think about Roshi Kapleau, I would say, almost every day, Rafe muses. And I'm well aware of his flaws, and I think he was too. He was very dedicated. He was as ethical as he could be. Did he have shortcomings in terms of how he treated people? He did. I think they were the same way he treated himself, the harshness with which he treated himself. And the love that he found in Zen was something that he expressed equally out into the world. He was a very unusual man for his generation. His taking in of myth, his taking in of other perspectives, his commitment to vegetarianism, not simply for health reasons, but as a way of not harming animals and the earth. When you think of the world he came out of, his flexibility in doing all that is pretty remarkable. And he was tremendously funny and tremendously sensitive. In the officialdom of the structures he created, they weren't the best modes for him to be the person he actually was. But when you were fortunate enough to kind of become his family, it all emerged. And I think it was when he retired from being a Zen teacher that he could really mature as Philip Kapleau, and he did. He kept working very hard. No teacher is perfect, which is why when he retired, I began working with Aiken Roshi to correct some of the things I felt were important to be corrected. By the same token, I also feel that Roshi Kapleau was a great human being, one to whom I owe my life. Teigen Henderson of the Toronto Zen Center is Sinyanograph Roshi's first Dharma heir. One thing about Roshi Kapleau's practice was it was always there. It was always available. He loved to go on walks, and at one time I was walking with him in New Current. We were just walking in Rochester. I was visiting for a ceremony. We were going somewhere, and you was talking about this apartment he had to give up, that he loved his apartment. And Roshi piped up, "Better to have loved and lost." You know, a cliche. But when he said it, somehow it wasn't a cliche. It had a deeper meaning. It was really like, oh yeah, you know? It was like everything he said had that kind of quality, which made you look more deeply into it. It was not just his words. There was a teaching there. That was Roshi. There was another time I was in Toronto, and he was well known by this time, and somebody came to the door and said, I want to meet Roshi Kapleau. Where is he? Where is he? I said, upstairs. This guy came in, he ran upstairs. He took one look at Roshi, turned around and ran out of the house. And he never came back. It was like he was a mirror. Whatever that guy brought with him, it just scared him. And he turned around and was gone. The last time I saw Roshi Kapleau, and this is the end, the last time I saw Roshi Kapleau alive, Mitrik recalls, he was quite impacted by the Parkinson's. One of the side effects of the Parkinson's meds is they can, in addition to letting you move, really make you move. And so he would constantly, involuntarily and uncontrollably wave his arms around to the point of even knocking his glasses off. And his voice was almost a whisper. You could hardly hear him talk. It was difficult for him to talk. I spent time with him in that condition. Back then, they were only allowing people to spend 15 minutes at a time with him. And then his main caregiver, who was a student and a nurse, would come in and say, Roshi, do you want to continue, or is it time for this person to leave? She came in several times, and each time he said, no, it's not time yet. We didn't speak. We just sat there in each other's company with a deep and clear and tranquil, wordless communion between us. It was not necessary to have words. I treasure that time with him. A second thing was that in my observation, he never quit practicing. Never quit working on himself. He sat zazen daily without fail, and as soon as he could see where he was caught, when he could see it, in some negative habit pattern, that was simply the end of it. I never saw it in him again. It was remarkable. There he was, growing older and older, a time in life when so many people got frozen in their negative habit patterns, and he just continued to practice zazen, continued to practice the long maturation, and continued to grow. We'll stop here and recite our great vows for all.